They were kings without crowns, ruling cities from the shadows with fear, loyalty, and blood. This is Pantheon history, and today we're exploring the question, why were the Mafia so powerful? The roots of the Mafia run deep into the blood-soaked soil of 19th century Sicily, a land trapped between invaders, feudal landlords, and corrupt officials. Sicily was a place where the law was less a shield and more a weapon wielded by the powerful against the weak. Justice, if it came at all, came slowly and at a price. In this environment of violence and betrayal, trust in official institutions collapsed, and a new kind of power was born. Private networks of families and clans offered something the government could not: protection, loyalty, and swift retribution. The earliest forms of the Mafia were less about global criminal empires and more about survival. They collected debts, enforced deals, punished betrayal, and guarded landowners' estates in exchange for a cut of the profits. Honor, loyalty, and violence were the currency of this underground society. Over time, these local groups evolved into a shadow state with their own codes, alliances, and silent wars. Figures like Vito Cascioferro embodied this transition, a man who rose from local enforcer to a symbol of organized power, blending brutality with a sharp political mind. In Sicily, titles meant little. What mattered was how many men would fight for you, and how much fear your name carried, and how willing you were to spill blood to defend it. This was the true birth of the Mafia. Not a single organization, but a way of life rooted in distrust, shaped by necessity, and fueled by a relentless hunger for power in a world where survival demanded it. When waves of Italian immigrants crossed the Atlantic at the end of the 19th century, many carried with them little more than their names, their traditions, and the scars of a homeland that offered them little protection. They disembarked onto the streets paved not with gold, but with broken promises. In the teeming slums of New York, Chicago, and New Orleans, they found poverty that rivaled the hardship they had left behind, compounded by a cold, foreign hostility. Jobs were scarce, discrimination was rampant, and official protection was often little more than a cruel joke. The police were indifferent, the courts were slow, and for many, justice was something that only existed in stories. It did not take long for the old instances to resurface. In the absence of trust in official institutions, Italian communities turned inward, leaning on familiar structures of family, loyalty, and private enforcement. The Mafia's model of protection, silent threats, and swift punishment crossed the ocean with them, adapting itself to the new landscape. Where businesses needed guarding, debts needed collecting, and disputes needed settling, the Mafia found a place. To many in these immigrant communities, the choice was simple: turn to an uncaring government, or turn to men who could guarantee results, no matter the cost. What began as survival hardened into something more permanent and organized. Crime families formed, staking out territories block by block, and in the back rooms of butcher shops and smoke-filled neighborhood taverns, agreements were made, alliances forged, and rivalries born. They acted as protectors when it served their interests, and predators when ambition demanded more. Loyalty was enforced through favors and fear alike, binding communities not through law, but through necessity. The American dream had promised freedom, prosperity, and security. For many Italian immigrants, it delivered poverty, suspicion, and violence. The Mafia thrived in that broken promise, offering its own brutal version of protection in a world where survival, once again, belonged to those willing to seize it. When the United States passed the Volstead Act in 1920, banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol, it did not stamp out demand. It simply created a vast, untapped black market. For the Mafia, prohibition was not a hindrance, it was an invitation. And they seized it with both hands. Almost overnight, the scattered networks of Mafia families found themselves at the heart of a booming underground economy. Bootlegging operations stretched from the forests of Canada to the docks of New Orleans, moving whiskey, gin, and rum through hidden warehouses, corrupt shipping yards, and backroom deals. Entire smuggling routes were carved into the American landscape, guarded not by governments, but by men loyal only to profit and blood. In the cities, violence followed the rivers of cash. Rival gangs fought for control over speakeasies, supply lines, and territories. Streets ran red as the Mafia defended their interests with brutal efficiency, orchestrating assassinations, bombings, and ambushes. Events like the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago sent a clear message. Betrayal and competition would be answered with gunfire, not negotiation. Nowhere was this transformation more visible than in Chicago, where a single man came to symbolize the age. Al Capone, known as Scarface to some and the Big Fella to others, rose from the shadows to rule the city with a blend of brutal violence, strategic generosity, and sheer magnetic force. Capone turned the city's police, judges, and politicians into willing accomplices or silent witnesses. His empire was built not just on murder and intimidation, but on a deep understanding of human greed and weakness. But Chicago was only one place of the empire. In New York, Detroit, New Orleans, and beyond, Mafia families flourished, carving up the nation's illegal alcohol trade between them. Some operated in secret while others flaunted their wealth, attending public events, donating to charities, and presenting themselves as legitimate businessmen. The line between gangster and gentleman blurred, and the public, often aware of the truth, chose to look the other way. Prohibition created rivers of cash that the Mafia used to entrench themselves even further into American life. Bribes flowed as freely as liquor, ensuring that law enforcement often looked the other way. Politicians campaigned on promises of morality while quietly accepting the money that kept their machines running. Judges, once seen as pillars of justice, could be bought with a single envelope. In this world, the Mafia flourished not in the shadows, but often in plain sight, wearing tailored suits, shaking hands with city officials, and attending charity balls alongside the very men they owned. Prohibition was meant to cleanse America's soul. Instead, it gave the Mafia its golden age, crowning them kings of a hidden empire that stretched from the dingiest speakeasies to the halls of power itself. The Mafia's power did not rest solely on guns, money, or fear. It rested on something older and far more unbreakable. Silence. The Code of Omerta was the sacred unwritten law that bound every member to secrecy, a pact sealed not with signatures, but with blood, honor, and the certainty of death. Omerta was not the creation of the Mafia. Its roots ran deeper. Born in Sicily's long history of foreign rulers and corrupt officials, where speaking to outside authorities was seen as treachery, not just to one's friends, but to one's entire community. In that world, loyalty was not an option, it was survival. Within the Mafia, omerta became absolute. To speak was to betray. To betray was to die. Members were taught from the beginning that their tongue could be more dangerous than an enemy's bullet. Questions from the police were met with blank stares. Testimonies that might have torn the organization apart never came. Even those arrested for brutal crimes knew that silence was expected, that confession would not spare them, and that cooperation with authorities would mean their families, their friends, and even distant acquaintances might pay the price. In the Mafia's world, death was never random. It was calculated, patient, and inevitable. The enforcement of omerta made early policing efforts almost hopeless. Prosecutors could arrest a dozen men for murder and come away with nothing but shrugs. Courtrooms filled with silent defendants, juries filled with whispers instead of evidence. Entire investigations collapsed because no one, not even the victims' families, would speak. For police and federal agents, it was like chasing shadows across blood-stained streets. Breaking omerta was not just a betrayal of comrades, it was a betrayal of a way of life, of ancestors who had survived through silence and loyalty when governments could not be trusted. To betray the Mafia was to strip oneself of honor, of family, of the right to protection. It was a final act, and it was punished with a final sentence. In this world, silence was more than a tactic. It was a weapon sharper than any blade, stronger than any wall. It forged an empire that could not be infiltrated, an invisible fortress built on fear, loyalty, and the certain knowledge that words, once spoken, could never be taken back. Power for the Mafia was never meant to stay confined to the back alleys and speakeasies. As their wealth grew, so too did their ambition. Beyond bootlegging and racketeering, the Mafia began to weave itself into the fabric of legitimate American business. Construction companies, waste management firms, shipping operations, and labor unions all became fertile ground. Through bribes, threats, silent partnerships, and the promise of protection, the Mafia moved beyond street crime and built an empire rooted in contracts, concrete, and cash. In cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia, no building rose without a quiet nod from the right family. Nowhere was this more evident than in New York's infamous Concrete Club, a cartel of Mafia-approved contractors who controlled who could build, when they could build, and at what price. From skyscrapers to schools, the Mafia's influence reached into the foundations of the city itself, rigging bids, extorting payments, and dictating the flow of billions of dollars. Materials were supplied by companies under Mafia control, and inflated costs were simply passed on to taxpayers and business owners who had no choice but to pay. Labor racketeering became another pillar of their power. Construction unions, trucking unions, garment industry unions, all were infiltrated and manipulated to serve the interests of organized crime. Bribery, intimidation, embezzlement, and silent threats ensured that no strike, no shipment, no major project moved without Mafia approval. Figures like Jimmy Hoffa, rising through the ranks of the Teamsters, blurred the line between labor leadership and organized crime, further entrenching the Mafia influence in industries vital to the nation's economy. The Mafia's grip on ports tightened just as fiercely. Along the waterfronts of New York and New Jersey, control over shipping meant control over smuggling, cargo theft, and a quiet taxation of goods moving across the world. Smuggled alcohol Stolen electronics and even narcotics passed through Mafia-controlled docks, protected by stevedores and supervisors who answered to their true masters in smoke-filled back rooms. With their hold over labour and commerce came something far more dangerous: political power. Union leaders indebted to the Mafia could deliver entire blocks of votes to chosen candidates, ensuring that the politicians who rose to power owed their success not to the people, but to men operating in the shadows. Favourable contracts, city permits, judicial appointments all became part of a silent trade where loyalty was bought and sold behind closed doors. The economic impact of this control was devastating. Prices across industries were artificially inflated by the mob tax, a cost quietly built into the price of everything from concrete to groceries. Small business owners paid for protection they did not want, facing vandalism or arson if they refused. Entire sectors of the economy were quietly siphoned dry by the invisible hand of organised crime, while the public, largely unaware, footed the bill. What made the Mafia's powers so dangerous wasn't just the threat of violence lurking beneath the surface, but how normal it all appeared. To the public, many Mafia associates were respectable figures, dressed in fine suits, attending church, hosting charity events, shaking hands with mayors and police chiefs. Yet behind every handshake, every contract, every smiling photograph, there was a quiet network of fear, loyalty, and silent coercion binding the entire system together. The Mafia understood that true power was not only seized by force, it was written into ledgers, poured into skyscrapers, and paved across highways stitched invisibly into the very economy of the nation. It was a kingdom built not just with blood, but with bricks, ballots, and business suits. The Mafia ruled not only through fear, but through something far more complex. Within their own communities, Mafia figures were not always seen purely as villains. In neighbourhoods abandoned by indifferent governments and corrupt police, the Mafia stepped in to offer services that no official institution would provide. They became the judges, the bankers, the enforcers, and in doing so, blurred the line between tyrant and protector. Loans were handed out when banks turned their backs. A struggling shopkeeper could find a lifeline, though it always came with a price. Disputes between neighbours, between businesses, even between families, were settled not by long court battles, but by a quiet meeting with a local boss, whose word carried the force of law. In a world where calling the police could mean hours of waiting or no response at all, the Mafia delivered swift, brutal justice. Theft, betrayal, disrespect, all were met with consequences that came quickly and left no room for confusion. For many, it was easier, and often safer, to turn to the Mafia than to authorities. They understood the rules, they knew the price, and in some ways, they trusted the old codes more than the hollow promises of distant officials. A Mafia boss might be feared, but he was also a fixture of the community, attending weddings, funding church repairs, handing out turkeys at Christmas. Acts of generosity and violence existed side by side, woven into the fabric of everyday life. In this vacuum of official power, the Mafia created their own system of governance. It was not democratic, it was not fair, but it was predictable. Those who lived by the code were protected, those who crossed the line faced retribution. It was a world where loyalty was repaid, betrayal was punished, and survival meant knowing who truly held the power on your street. The Mafia were tyrants and protectors in the same breath, feared for their ruthlessness, respected for their authority, and, in the darkest corners of their communities, sometimes even mourned when they were gone. For a time, the Mafia seemed untouchable, but no empire, no matter how deeply rooted, can escape the rot that grows from within. Beneath the surface of loyalty and silence, old grudges, rival ambitions, and personal betrayals simmered. Internal struggles erupted into open warfare. none more defining than the Castellamarese that tore through New York in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The bloody conflict pitted rival factions against each other, with the old guard bosses clinging to power while younger, more ruthless figures rose through the ranks. Streets turned into battlegrounds, assassinations became commonplace, and the Mafia's internal codes of honour frayed under the weight of ambition. When the smoke finally cleared, the Mafia world had been reshaped. The 5 families of New York emerged from the wreckage, each controlling their slice of the city with a fragile, often violent balance. Yet even this new order was never truly stable. Power struggles continued behind closed doors, alliances shifted, and old rivalries smouldered beneath a thin veneer of unity. At the same time, external pressure was building. Law enforcement had spent decades frustrated by the Mafia's wall of silence. Arrests were made, cases were built, but convictions were rare. The Code of Omerta had kept the inner workings of organized crime hidden from the world. Yet cracks began to spread. In 1963, Joe Valachi broke the silence publicly, testifying before Congress and revealing names, structures, and rituals that had been secret for generations. It was the first public betrayal, a signal that the old bonds of loyalty were beginning to weaken. Generational shifts within the Mafia also played their part. Newer members, drawn more by the allure of wealth than by old-world codes of honor, were less disciplined, more reckless, and less willing to sacrifice their lives for the tradition they barely respected. The world around them was changing, and so too was the Mafia from within. Law enforcement adapted as well. Advances in surveillance technology, wiretapping, hidden recording devices, and undercover operations slowly chipped away at the Mafia's defenses. Conversations once protected by silence were now captured on tape. Deals once hidden in shadows exposed by microphones and cameras. The traditional shields of secrecy became increasingly vulnerable. The real turning point came in 1970 with the passing of the RICO Act, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Prosecutors no longer had to chase individual crimes. They could dismantle entire organizations, holding bosses accountable for the actions of their soldiers. Silence became a liability. The threat of long prison sentences, asset seizures, and protection for informants turned fear against the very families it once protected. Then, the unthinkable happened. Made men began to flip. In the 1990s, Sammy the Bull Gravano, underboss of the Gambino family, testified against John Gotti, the so-called Teflon Don, delivering a crushing blow to the Mafia's reputation for invincibility. Bosses who had once ruled their empires from fortified social clubs now found themselves dragged into courtrooms, their secrets laid bare for the world to see. The media played its part too. High-profile trials, confessions, and exposés pulled back the veil. The public saw not untouchable kings, but flawed, desperate men fighting to keep their crumbling empires alive. The myth of the Mafia, so carefully cultivated for decades, began to unravel in front of the cameras. While the traditional Italian-American Mafia's power faded, organized crime itself did not vanish. It evolved, shifting into new forms, new faces, new methods. But the era of the Mafia as America's hidden empire was coming to an end. The Mafia's fortress, built over generations from fear, silence, and blood, did not collapse in a single moment. It crumbled slowly, eaten away from within by ambition, betrayal, and the relentless march of a world that no longer feared them as it once did. The real power of the Mafia may have crumbled, but their legend only grew stronger. Even as federal indictments dismantled families and courtroom betrayals stripped away their invincibility, pop culture stepped in to immortalize them. Films, books, and even television shows crafted a new mythology, one where Mafia figures were not simply criminals, but tragic anti-heroes, bound by loyalty, family, and honour in a world that no longer understood them. No story captured this transformation more powerfully than The Godfather. Released in 1972, at the very moment the Mafia's real-world empire began to falter, it reimagined them as noble outlaws, reluctant kings caught between duty and survival. Marlon Brando's quiet menace, Al Pacino's cold dissent, the whispered codes of respect and retribution all reshaped the public image of the Mafia into something grander, something almost timeless. Violence was still there, but it was framed by tragedy, sacrifice, and a lost sense of order. Other stories followed, from Goodfellas to The Sopranos, peeling back the glamour to reveal the brutality beneath, yet still feeding the fascination. In the eyes of the public, the Mafia became more than an organized crime syndicate. They became symbols of loyalty corrupted, power pursued at any cost, and a way of life lost to history. The reality, messy and bloody and desperate, faded behind the weight of a legend. Though remnants of the old families still survive, and organized crime has simply evolved rather than vanished, the era of the Mafia ruling cities from the shadows is over. Their true empires lie broken, but their legend endures, larger than life, carved into the power of imagination of the world, born from blood, loyalty, and the relentless hunger for power. So then, why were the Mafia so powerful? Because when law failed, they seized the role of judge, jury, and executioner. Because they built empires not just with bullets, but with contracts and silence. And because even as their world crumbled, their legend only grew stronger.